The ancients were inspired by the idea of great men. These men invariably lived hundreds, if not thousands of years before them in a more glorious age. They were tall and they were strong, and they ate so much meat that it's a wonder they were not afflicted by gout. They consorted with women who rivaled the goddesses. Many of them were said to have possessed divine blood. Both the mortal and the divine ones fascinated the gods who sought to engineer their lives. They were the sort of characters who populated classical foundation myths. Every culture has produced foundation myths. These usually take the form of elaborate stories woven to explain the origins of a people and its customs. The Romans spoke of Romulus overthrowing his twin brother Remus to establish their city on the Palatine Hill. The boys were the sons of the war god Mars and Rhea Silvia, the Vestal Virgin he raped, which accounted for the Romans' warlike nature. They were famously nourished by a she-wolf, thence their unnatural strength, before being raised by a mortal couple. The Romans also venerated Aeneas, who, on a timeline quite incompatible with this story, fought in the Trojan War and escaped the burning city with a band of refugees to establish a new home in Italy. Aeneas brought with him his son, known to Virgil as Iulus, and thus imagined as a founding member of the gens Iulia, the family to which Julius Caesar and Augustus, his great-nephew, the future emperor, belonged. Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, is, at its most basic, an extended foundation myth intended to legitimize, but also subtly critique the new mode of rule introduced under Augustus following the collapse of the Roman Republic. In the poem, Aeneas is made to travel through Carthage on his way to Italy and witness for himself the development of a Carthaginian foundation myth. The people of Carthage, situated in the area of Tunis in modern Tunisia, had recently relocated from Phoenician Tyre in modern Lebanon. Their queen Dido had led a boatful of disaffected Phoenicians with her, to North Africa, where she requested a patch of land only so big as to be covered by a single ox hide. She ingeniously cut the ox hide into the finest shreds, which she laid end to end upon the ground, thereby encompassing the perimeter of Carthage, the new city of Carthage. The hill around which Dido supposedly laid her hide is still known as Byrsa, from the Greek for ox hide. In the Aeneid, Dido prays that Aeneas will stay and become part of Carthage's development, but the gods have other ideas for the heroic escapee of Troy. The Trojan War was a foundation myth of another kind. Most people living in the classical world believe that a war truly had been fought at Troy, near the Hellespont at the west of Turkey, and that it marked the separation between old times and new. The men who were said to have fought in this war, an estimated 400 years before Homer, so around the 12th century BC, were very much of the great men mold. They were big and they were strong. They were so strong, in fact, that the warrior Diomedes in the Iliad is able to raise a boulder, which no man of later generations was able to. In many cases, they had divine parentage. So we think of Aeneas, Achilles, Odysseus. These characters were the ancient equivalents of modern superheroes. It was not simply children who worshipped them, but grown men, and particularly men with political ambitions. Throughout classical history, political leaders strove to claim their various heroes as ancestors. The Pentelidae, who ruled the Greek island of Lesbos until the 6th century BC, declared themselves to be descendants of Agamemnon, who led the Greek army to victory in the Iliad. Hundreds of years later, Julius Caesar promoted his alleged lineage via Iulus from Venus, which those acquainted with Caesar's love life might say was only too appropriate. There was clearly much to gain from forging connections with people who had founded thriving cities. Myth and early history were so closely intertwined that some of these lineages even carried a degree of credibility at the time. Some possibly even believed them to be true. The Pentelidae did not rest on the laurels of their own nobility. Their name might have been famous on the island of Lesbos and in their native Thessaly for generations, but it had nothing on that of Agamemnon. Claiming to share blood with a hero was not simply an exercise in establishing legitimacy to rule. It was a way of instilling confidence in voters or the public that they represented. If their ancestors were successful, there was every hope that they might be too. Foundation myths were often of a personal as well as a political interest to world leaders. So Alexander the Great took a detour whilst on campaign to perform honours for Priam, king of Troy, as well as Athena and Achilles, to whom he believed he was related. Alexander famously slept with a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow, and the poem sort of served almost as a sort of Bible. Contains eternal truths about ruling, serving, fighting, existing that transcend history. So I would argue it was not wholly opportunistic to seek to establish authority through it. Modern politicians would be hard-pressed to sustain the tradition and claim allegiance with any figure of the mythical past. Genealogy, of course, is now a highly developed discipline. Ancient heroes nevertheless continue to be name-checked. Boris Johnson kept a bust on his desk of Pericles, the populist strategos or general of democratic Athens in 5th century BC, and he's hailed him as his personal hero. Pericles was a tremendous statesman, but like the Homeric heroes, he was imperfect. One of the most egregious quotes we might say attributed to him today was, "Great is the glory of the woman who is least spoken about, whether for good or for ill." It's difficult to think of a scenario in which this maxim still holds, although perhaps female members of a cabinet in crisis could possibly find some truth in it. In his final speech as Prime Minister last autumn, Johnson referenced another classical hero, Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, a rural politician of 5th century BC Rome, who saved his city from invasion and then returned to his farmer's plough. Cincinnatus was said to have gone back into politics at a later date, so Johnson's classical reference was naturally overanalyzed and taken as evidence that he believed his work in Downing Street was far from over. The theory that he'd be back has diminished in strength slightly in recent days following his resignation as an MP. Johnson's successor, Liz Truss, chose to quote Seneca the Younger in her own parting speech mere weeks later. "It's not because things are difficult that we do not dare," she said. "It is because we do not dare that they are difficult." Seneca may lack the heroic cachet of Achilles, but in the Roman world, he was idolized for the strength of his convictions. In opening his veins at Nero's request, he died what was viewed at the time as a hero's death. Cincinnatus and Seneca are no longer so famous as to constitute part of a universal language. Today's politicians do not quote ancient figures in order to clarify their thoughts. They, in fact, risk blurring their points and driving a wedge between themselves and the public by having recourse to a world that very few actually have an opportunity to study now, today. So why look to antiquity at all? I would argue that many in Westminster today are naturally aligned with the politicians of the ancient world. They're not seeking to impress with the loftiness of their learning, still less confound with references that many will find oblique. Rather, they reach into antiquity for affirmation of their own authority, in much the same way as the rulers of Lesbos did when they promoted a connection to Agamemnon. They can't pretend to be blood relations, but they can evoke the spirit of a glorious, now mysterious past. Figures from antiquity, even mythical ones, still have weight in the modern world. The eternal guidance that Alexander found in the Iliad has come to be attached to antiquity more widely. Ancient wisdom seems almost oracular, owing to the mystery that envelops it in the modern imagination. You don't need to understand it to believe that it carries some kind of long-lost truth. It's in this way that foundation myths continue to grow. Homeric heroes continue to achieve their desire for kleos, a glorious reputation that will outlive them. There's a tacit assumption that kleos could in fact outweigh human flaws. Agamemnon, let us remember, sacrificed his own daughter to secure a fair wind for his voyage to Troy. His wife murdered him after he returned home from war. Cincinnatus was hardly popular with the less wealthy members of Rome. We might have expected these factors to render these figures personae non gratae in today's flagrantly judgmental society. But we are perhaps more grown up in our approach to the classical world than we are to many later periods of history. Our quest for some hallowed truth in the midst of time again propels us to take the bad with the good. Most importantly, we implicitly understand that heroism is a valuable fiction. This is arguably the most useful lesson to draw from Homer, Virgil, and the others today. Aside from the flaws individual to each hero, there are flaws inherent to the concept of heroism. In the first book of Homer's Iliad, Nestor, the elderly king of Pylos, tells Agamemnon and Achilles that they are inferior to some of the men who've come before them, the likes of which he says he's unlikely ever to see again. So even Homeric heroes could be outshone by others. There is an emptiness to instilling greatness in figures of the past, then, because those self-same figures instilled greatness in their own ancestors, giving rise to a continuous cycle of projecting virtue onto people we can never truly know. This is what I believe Hesiod, Homer's near contemporary poet, was describing when he outlined 5 ages of man, from the glorious Golden Age through to the long dire age of iron. We recognize in this lineage the fallacy of Golden Age thinking, and through this, the fallacy of foundation myths. As fortifying as it may feel to forge connections with the past, in doing so, we lay ourselves bare to accusations of not being good enough, not because we fail to measure up in this long descent of man, but because the quest for absolute greatness is ultimately impossible to fulfill. Seeing as this is so, there is an argument for keeping the ancient foundation myths alive by embracing even their most erring and double-edged characters, for we are unlikely to find anything better. These myths and the reception of them, in fact, highlight the fruitlessness of seeking perfection. This is a particularly pertinent consideration in an age of cancel culture, which frequently holds historical figures to account for failing to live up to modern standards of behaviour and ethics. Politicians, ancient and modern, who associate themselves with classical figures for public or private affirmation, actually provide a useful service. For all that their adoption of classical exemplar may seem arrogantly fanciful, it actually serves to remind us that it's possible to distinguish good qualities where bad exist and to push against the false narrative of eternal decline. The quest for greatness, doomed though it may be, constitutes an essential part of history and our efforts to situate ourselves within it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daisy, for this excellent start. Going back to Boris Johnson, has he shown in any way why he admires Pericles in actions?
So Boris Johnson has said that Pericles has been a hero of his for a long time for 3 main reasons. He says that he admires his the fact that he's actually helped orchestrate the building of magnificent buildings such as the Parthenon. So he's been great on infrastructure. He had thundering, sort of oratory like thunder and lightning, which he admired. And he also advocated rule by the many rather than the few. So the idea of democracy and sort of all of us having a part to play.
Could we say that Boris Johnson improves as a politician by having Pericles as a role model?
I think, at the very least, I think it's useful to have a heroic model from the past. I don't know whether he would even himself say that he's measured up to him, because he'd no longer be a hero in his own eyes if he could exceed him.
How many British voters knows who Cincinnatus is?
I'd say a very tiny proportion. Maybe that would change.
And will they vote for Boris Johnson because of his admiration for this Roman hero?
No.
No. So
no.
Is it of any use?
It is of use to him personally, I would say. I think it's useful. I think what drives you on always, one of the ideas of this hunt for kleos, is the idea that you're going to be remembered for doing something great. So I think if you can hold someone in your own mind as a precedent, that will propel you to try and measure yourself against that person and to do better. So I think it will actually service everyone on some level.